Today I'm going to be showing you how I do this kind of deeply textured inky stuff that you see sometimes in my paintings. You can see some more over here in these areas. Here's another painting, a newer one in progress that I'm working on, but I've also used this same technique in the black textury bits along the edges and even the little bits of speckle that you see along here and in these areas. To start off, I'm going to show you the supplies I use for this. I have Winsor & Newton ink, liquid Indian ink. It is this specific brand and type that gets this textury result. Secondly, I have a couple of brushes. These are pretty cheap ones, despite how they look. People are always asking me, what brand are those brushes? They're Royal and Langnickel. They're synthetics. They're fairly cheap. I use them for things where I don't mind abusing the bristles. And I have a watercolor palette with a couple of colors prepared already. I have French Ultramarine and Lunar Blue. By the way, I have done a demonstration of this technique that I'm about to show you before in my YouTube videos in the past. However, it was a long time ago when I first did it, and I wasn't really good with the videography. So that's why I'm doing it again this time. Hopefully, my camera is actually oriented the right way for you guys. That will be better than having the vertical orientation, right? Among other things. So, one final thing. I have my paper with my piece ready to do a little bit of that texturization up here. I have a very rough sketch on here, super rough, because one of the things about doing this technique is it really makes a mess, to put it bluntly, and sometimes you end up not being able to see much of your sketch underneath it afterwards. So if there's any really crucial important parts of your sketch, well, what I usually do is I photograph this so that I have a reference to refer back to in case I've obliterated everything. And secondly, I draw pretty darkly the elements that are key importance so that I will definitely be able to see them once I have put all my inky stuff on top. Alright, so the first thing I do is I'm going to take a large flat brush. Actually, here's a bigger one. And I'm going to just take some water, this is clean water, and wet down the areas where I want to possibly have some of my inky wash, inky textury stuff going over. And then I take my watercolors, and this is not an exact science. There's a lot of randomness that goes into this phase of, well, this whole process actually, this whole thing. So I just grab some of these colors and I lay down a base color tone for these areas. I'm being fairly messy about it because one of the things with doing this technique is I'm trying to accomplish randomized textures because I love building off of the chaos of pigmentation, of pigment just sort of pooling and clumping and getting all weird on me. And I love to use that as a basis from which to then launch the more defined aspects of painting. Alright, so I have that. I'm going to dab off some of these areas where I had the birds because I want to be able to see those later. And while everything is still wet, you have to move quickly. Oh, first, got to shake this up because it tends to have the sediment settle at the bottom. And I take a brush, go in there, and just splatter some onto my page. Don't need a whole lot. A little bit of this actually gets very effective. All right. Again, moving quickly while things are still wet. I then take my water here, which is now kind of black, but it doesn't really matter, and I start dabbing a lot of water. I'm going to switch to a bigger brush because I want more liquid on my brush. And start moving my paper surface around. Got to tilt it to make the ink run in the right directions. And as it runs like this, it sort of clumps and gives you nice little bits of texture. I also just take my brush and flick it. And then I let a lot of the excess liquid run off the edge of my page. You got to be careful which direction you orient your page as you're doing that, because if you, for example, don't want any vertical streaks going up, you don't want to tilt it this way as you're letting the liquid run off. You probably want to tilt it sideways or at an angle towards the corner. Mop up some of that liquid so that it doesn't make a huge mess on my desk. And if there's portions where I don't want such a sharp edge to everything, I also take this time before everything is dried to sort of dab the excess moisture off of that boundary as well. That makes it easier to blend later with other portions of the painting. So that's a basic technique that I'm using here for this. There are other pigments and mediums that also can achieve this very textury effect. It's a matter of just playing around with a lot of different things and seeing what happens. I discovered this particular ink doing this purely on accident when I was doing large washes across a painting, and I noticed how it really clustered and granulated, and I really wanted to try to utilize that effect and replicate it. And so over time I've been doing a lot of paintings using this and gotten more confident with how I'm tilting my painting around as I'm applying it, you know, moving things around and trying to get the little blotchy bits into the right sections of my painting. You know, I might actually add some more over here because most of it, I think I didn't have enough ink when I was doing my little tilting thing. But, you know, you can just add more and keep going and just repeat the process that I just showed you. Add more water, do the little tilty thing, and keep going until you get the right kind of textury look that you're going for. And once I get this base, then I let it dry. It takes a while because there's so much water, so much liquid on my page that it does take usually about an hour to dry or so before I can proceed with the next part of my painting. It helps if you can put it outside in the sunlight. If it's a nice warm sunny day, which I'm probably going to do today because I do have that benefit. All right. So yeah, I'm going to set this out in the sun, let it dry, and I'll show you the dried results in just a little bit. Now that my surface has had a chance to dry, I can begin the next phase of this process. So the ink that I used, the Winsor Newton stuff that you saw me use in the previous phase, it is, as you see here, non-waterproof. That means that when it's on my paper now, if I were to take a brush and to start trying to paint a wash over it, it would lift and smear and I would lose all this beautiful granulated stuff that it has done. So in order to prevent that from happening, there are two options that I use. One of them is to just spray with a workable fixative, and the second option is I use Daniel Smith transparent watercolor ground. It's called transparent, but as you can see, it is not. It's actually more translucent if you use it thin enough. If you use it thick, it will start to get milky on your surface. So I try to keep my layers very thin when I'm using this, but what I'll do is I'll take a flat brush like this, and I will just dab lightly in the areas where I have a lot of the beautiful inky textures that I don't want to lose. One thing to keep in mind when using watercolor ground, or even for using fixative also, this applies, is that putting anything other than watercolor onto the surface of your paper is going to change how the paper receives the watercolor and how it takes the pigment. So what I mean by this is that you can't use watercolor ground on an area and then expect that when you paint over it later, there's going to be a smooth transition of your color without any noticeable variation. There's going to be a definitive variation to the textural quality of things. So, in this situation where my whole purpose is to get variation of texture, that's not an issue for me. So it's more of an issue if you were trying to use it to, I don't know, in some smooth area where you were going to have some nice, beautifully graded wash. Or, for example, in some sensitive portions of your painting where the detail really matters and you don't want to have a sudden shift, like on someone's face, for example, between the colors and the textures that you're using. So that's just something to keep in mind. And the same goes with workable fixative too. Workable fixative, it's called workable, but it's more like semi-workable as far as watercolors are concerned, because it does tend to seal up the pores of the paper so that if you spray it on too thickly, your watercolors, your liquid is just going to bead up and roll off your page. It's going to become completely waterproof, which is not really desirable when you're painting with watercolors. So if I do use workable fixative in a situation like this, I try to only spray it in the areas where I know I need it. So in this piece, if I were to use workable fixative, what I like to do actually is I'll take a paper towel or a piece of paper and just sort of loosely crumple it up and cover up the areas where I don't want the spray to be. And having something wadded up like this as a mask means that you have a more not so much of a hard line with your spraying. So when I spray over this, the areas that get hit the most are going to be up here, and this area is going to be sort of graded by doing that, and that just protects the sensitive areas where I don't want any spray to hit, while not making a very hard definitive edge line along where I do want it to go. So those are just two of the options. And then I have to let this dry. This takes about 15 minutes to half an hour. It depends on how thickly I've painted my watercolor ground. And I haven't actually painted it very thickly. It's pretty thin. All you need is a very slight layer. And you really want to just move your brush as little as possible. So what I'm doing are these little stabbing type of things on it, because if you drag your brush, then you're going to smear everything and you're going to lose all these wonderful and beautiful little speckled dotty things that are going on. Now this is just the beginning of a painting. What you see here becomes the basis for how I build up my more defined and refined textures, the things that I'm doing intentionally. This is sort of the unintentional portion of it, sort of. I mean, I am dictating where I want these textures to go in the general vicinities of the piece, but as far as the specifics of it, I leave that up to chance, and I leave that up to just how the liquid flows and the pigment pools. And so this just becomes a starting point, a launching pad. And from here, I start to pick out the details, and I start to see shapes, and I will emphasize things and gradually build something up. So I have this piece again, which I showed you earlier. This portion of the tree trunk is in its early stages. I have just done the wash, and you can see I'm starting to build up shading along the side of the tree here and down into this area. In the upper portions of this painting, it's pretty developed, and you see traces of that inky texture in here, but you don't really see it in its raw form as you see over here, because I've utilized it just to sort of inform my decision-making process as I create my more intentional textures and things.